I don't know what we can talk about in this nation without talking about white superiority, honestly.
Who defines the meaning of God also defines the relationship between economy and God.
African Americans spent $1.3 trillion last year, making us the 16th wealthiest nation in the world. Why have we not turned those riches into wealth to develop our community?
Good evening, good afternoon, happy family. Welcome to another exciting edition of HAPI Talks. I'm your host tonight, Taki Grant. We have an exciting edition here tonight with Professor Robin Walker from the UK, discussing Africa's contribution to civilization and debunking the madness of Ron DeSantis. I know there's been a lot of talks about what's going on down there in Florida in regards to some of the madness Ron DeSantis is doing. So I'm glad we have Professor Walker here to discuss those things. If you haven't done so already, please like the video. Shout out to my brother Lorenzo Small. Come back to Lorenzo in a second. If you haven't, take this opportunity to like the video, share it to as many folks as you can, share it on your networks, drop a comment, give everyone a chance to kind of come in the building, kind of get settled before we get started on the show. For those people who have not heard, we have another wonderful journey to Kemet coming up in February. I hate calling it trips because it's so much more than a trip. This is definitely not the weekend getaway or anything like that. This is something so much more powerful, particularly when it comes to us, people of African and diaspora, going back home, seeing the continent, particularly going to ancient Kemet, one of our classical African civilizations, and seeing it maybe for the first, second, third, fourth time. We've been doing it now for over 3 decades, and it's amazing. And this one particular journey or pilgrimage coming up in February, something that we're all looking forward to. You haven't done so now, please take this opportunity to go register for this amazing experience. And call it an experience because it's such an enriching moment in your life. We have to also see this as an investment in yourself. People sometimes think about this as just kind of travel. This is an investment in who you are. Going to Kemet does something for Africans that no other place can do. So you have to see this as something that's going to better yourself, help you get to that next level, help you kind of help us accomplish what we need to accomplish. And say us, I mean the collective African family. Ancient Kemet definitely has that impact on you. So definitely want to see this as an investment in you. Now, the dates are February 16th to the 25th. That's 2024. We have our own private chartered cruise sailing up the Nile. On that cruise, we will have economic workshops, the likes of which also presentations by some of our great scholars like Mfudishi, who will be there with us during the duration of this exciting journey. The economic workshops tie into the theme of the overall trip, which is discover the origins of economics in Egypt with Hoppy, which is so very important. We need to understand who we are and on this earth. And as Africans, we have to see ourselves as people who, as Dr. Mavo put in Hoppy, economic actors. And we was always economic actors. And this journey to Kemet will illustrate that in the highest degree. So as we're looking at the Africans lived along the Nile performing economics in the very early stages of civilization, we will always have economic courses or just conversations that's going to gear us towards controlling our economics in this age. So it's very important that we make that connection. So as we sail up the Nile again in our chartered ship, we will also be enduring things like visiting the pyramids, the great temples, Apple Symbol, Philae, all the great monuments in Kemet. And as well as this trip will culminate what we call the Happy Dinner Gala. So family, definitely, you want to consider this highly as something that you really, really should do. Also, if you haven't taken this opportunity or taken an opportunity yet, we have the Happy Clearance Sale. And all our merchandise, everything was kind of marked down to make way for new merchandise. Family, you want to take this opportunity to go to hapifilm.com and get your gear and support the family that way. So very important that that happens, because that helps us kind of move everything forward. And while you're there, if you have not had your copy of the Hoppy film, please do so. Hoppy, Nubia, Tekken, all those films have been marked down, as well as with all the merchandise. We also have the Hoppy newsletter. Make sure to register for that so you can stay in touch, in tune with everything going on in the world of Hoppy. We have some more announcements. We'll save some of them as we go along. But in a second here, we're going to bring on Professor Walker. But lastly, I just want to say, for those people who've been showing that Hoppy love through Cash App and Super Chats, stars, please continue to do so. That helps kind of keep the mission moving forward. Definitely looking forward to future shows and future conversations with people like Professor Robin Walker and the like. But now, family, without any further ado, we're going to bring in Professor Walker, and we're going to get the show started.
Greetings, sir.
Greetings. How are you?
Life is going really, really good. Can't complain about anything.
Really, really good. That's good to hear. It's been some time. I think this may be your third or fourth time on HAPI Talks, I believe.
I think you're right. I think it is about the third or fourth time.
Yes.
Been, sir.
Yes. Welcome back. And it's always a pleasure to see you. How's things going in the UK these days?
We're surviving. We're holding up. I'm very pleased, though, that me and a group of people, we did some work in Ethiopia. So we're back. So that was some good work. But yeah, it's all good. It's all positive.
Okay. I know we have a topic that we're going to discuss. And I guess we maybe can kind of, first the first part, the African contributions and civilization and debunking the myth of DeSantis. But before we get into that, would you mind talking about some of the work you did in Ethiopia?
Basically, lots of things happened, but the most important thing is we got to see Lalibela. We got to see the City of Underground Churches. Very, very powerful experience. The Ethiopian government looked after us. It was really, really good. Positive experience.
Okay. It's good to hear. All right. So we understand you have a presentation that you'd like to show today?
Yeah, the only issue is the title is a little bit different to what you have. It's not Africa's contribution to civilization. It's enslaved people's contribution to civilization.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to hit DeSantis bullseye. The very issues we raised are the very issues we're going to address.
Okay. All right. We'll actually make that that slight change as well, and we'll change it to just so it can match up with the presentation. Enslaved contribution is enslaved people's contribution to civilization. Is that correct? Did I say it right?
Something like that. That would work. I mean, you don't need to change anything, but just letting you know that. So we're not going to be talking about Kemet. We're not going to be talking about Songhai. We're going to be talking about enslaved people.
Got it. Okay.
All right. Okay, can this be seen, sir?
Yes.
Okay, would you like me to start?
Yes.
Okay, so I represent the Black Secret Education Project. We are quietly empowering the people. Okay, today's session is called Addressing Ron DeSantis on the Technological Contributions of Enslaved Africans to Civilization. Technological contributions? What technological contributions? Well, you're going to learn today. So why are we here? I'm here to share some powerful Black history information that should be in the mainstream, but unfortunately isn't. Thank you for your valuable time. You are going to give me your time for 1 hour. I won't waste your time. I'm going to make sure you get quality over the next 1 hour. And thank you for entrusting me with your education. Okay, so what's in it for you? Well, you're going to learn empowering information on Black or African history, new information that will change the way you see yourself and how other people will see you, and ideas and concepts that will increase your personal effectiveness as you triumph through life. Now, our topics today are two topics. We're going to introduce the blacksecret.co.uk, which is the first online teaching resource for Black history and Pan-African heritage available all over the world, and new research in Black history. And that new research is going to be about the contributions of enslaved people to civilization. One of my teams are revolutionizing adult Pan-African education, and we produce something called the Black Secret Education Project. Now, the idea of the Black Secret is that it's a fundamental empowerment concept where we are quietly empowering the people. Now, what are we empowering the people with? Knowledge of history. We want to produce adults who can move themselves forward and the community forward. We want to engage people across the world with our cultural, historical program. We want to engage people in London, Toxteth, Harlem, Kingston, Atlanta, Abuja, Nairobi, Accra, wherever you are. We want to engage you, and we want to engage you in two ways: through the Black Secret Education Project and through the Black Secret Business Project. Now, the content is history content based on a book called When We Ruled. Now, what is When We Ruled?
I am a student of history, so I gotta recommend some history books, especially because it is Black History Month. When We Ruled by Robin Walker. This is one of the dopest books. Like, I promise you, this book is so bomb. It has color pictures in it, but the thing I love most about it, let me find it. It has a chronological order of all of the pharaohs from ancient Kemet. Check this out. This is so dope. I said ancient Kemet. So it has this chronological order of all of the pharaohs, and it goes from the first intermediate period to the Middle Kingdom, second intermediate. It's just all of the dynasties in chronological order of all of the different pharaohs, and then it has color pictures in it. Like I said, really, really dope. So if you are a student of history, make sure you get this book.
Now, the content of our course, The Black Secret, is based on When We Ruled. And an internet marketer told me there's at least £4,000 worth of information in When We Ruled. Now, who here has done my courses based on the book? Some of you, I know there's some people from Britain. And do you think I should have charged £4,000? Now, the Black Secret will be revealed in 5 phases over the next 12 months. Phase 1 of the education project is medieval African history and heritage. Phase 2 is ancient Africa. This is where we're dealing with Kemet and Kush and that kind of thing. Phase 3 is global Black people over the last 500 years, and that will include things like the African American civil rights struggle, the Black British civil rights struggle, etc. And that's what's available right now, more than 55 hours worth of Black history content. And then the next phase is our business project, which will drop in September. And then subsequent phases will be all the areas covered by the Portland Model baseline essays, including mathematics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, music and literature, art and architecture, business and entrepreneurship, and great thinkers in the social sciences. Now, how do we want the community to engage with us? Ultimately, we want 1 million African heritage homes all over the world to subscribe to our program. We want every African heritage university to subscribe to our program and make it available to their students. We want entrepreneurial people to sell our program as affiliates. If you're an affiliate marketer, you know what that is, and you want to get involved, go on our website, click where it says affiliates, and you can follow through because you will know what to do. Imagine what 1 million empowered households could achieve. Now, the big question is, why did we see the need to put this education program together in the first place? Here's why. There are people who see our history and heritage as something that they must oppose. Haters are always gonna hate. And the most recent hater to crawl out of the woodwork.
We fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
So who is this person? Well, what happened? Ron DeSantis has led a campaign, and some of the information made it into the newspapers. Florida rejects social studies textbooks that mention social justice, taking a knee, and other content of concern. And then the article says Florida rejected nearly 35% of social studies textbooks submitted by publishers. Wow. Now, did the political extremism stop there? Well, no, it didn't. Florida Board of Education approves new Black history standards that critics call a big step backward. So my thing then was, can I get hold of what the Florida Board of Education, what were they coming with? And I found the document. It says Florida State Academic Standards, Social Studies 2023. And the offensive paragraph is here. Analyze events that involved or affected Africans from the founding of the nation through Reconstruction. And there's something called a benchmark clarification where it says instruction includes how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit, says the Ron DeSantis influence curriculum. Now, what are the differences between these two sentences? Can you see the difference? Here's sentence A. How slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. And B. How enslaved people from Africa brought sciences and technologies to the Americas and the Caribbean, which were applied for the benefit of their enslavers. All right. Can we understand the difference between A and B? If you can understand this, put B in the chat. And perhaps someone can tell me if there's B's going in the chat. Anything in the chat, sir?
Yes. There's B's going in the chat.
There's B's going in the chat. All right. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting B is that's how we're going to attack the rest of this class. Who is this fictional character? Why is he important? If you know who the fictional character is, put him in the chat. Okay, what do you have in the chat, if anything?
I have a delay on here, but it's coming up soon. As soon as it comes up, I'll put it up.
Yeah.
Is that one of the names you're looking for?
Because I can't see that, all I can see is my presentation. Do you see?
Oh, you can see your presentation. All right, we have Preston John. We have Brer Rabbit.
Brer Rabbit. Okay, this is what Wikipedia says. Brer Rabbit is a central figure in an oral tradition passed down by African Americans of the southern United States and African descendants in the Caribbean, notably Afro-Bahamians and Turks and Caicos Islanders. He is a trickster who succeeds by his wits rather than by brawn, provoking authority figures and bending social mores as he sees fit, says Wikipedia. So here's the question. If different African populations across the diaspora have the same folklore, what does this prove? Let me tell you what it proves. It proves that if you've got people in the United States, people in Bahamas, people in Turks and Caicos Islands, they're running with the same mythology, then the mythology must be where those people started their trip before they ended up in the Americas. It must be of African origin. Now, did we know this? This is Joel Chandler Harris, and he wrote a book based on the stories passed to him by African Americans, and it became the Uncle Remus stories, the folklore of the old plantation. And then a book came out called American Trickster, Trauma, Tradition, and Brer Rabbit by Emily Zobel Marshall. And I'm going to show you what a book review of the book American Trickster has to say. And we get to the book review and it says, as a kid, I watched Bugs Bunny play his wascally tricks on Elmer Fudd, Yosemite Sam, and other characters. I never thought of the trickster rabbit in relation to Africa, even in my adulthood. I never thought about him in relation to the enslavement of millions of people. I always thought of him merely as an anthropomorphic wabbit that caused mischief and always succeeded. Emily Zobel Marshall draws this connection, if briefly, in her book American Trickster, tracing Bugs Bunny's lineage to Africa, specifically to the Yoruba and Ashanti trickster gods Eshu and Anansi, as one of the many manifestations of the rabbit trickster figure in the Black diaspora of the Americas. Through her book, Marshall details the story of Brer Rabbit, the trickster's reach, and the ways that Black writers like Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison countered the appropriation of the character by white authors such as Joel Chandler Harris and Beatrix Potter. Now, why the smoke for Beatrix Potter? Well, she did a book called The Tale of Peter Rabbit, and then volumes of this stuff came out. Now, can we prove the case against Beatrix Potter? This is what a right-wing newspaper in Britain says about Beatrix Potter. Beatrix Potter is accused of cultural appropriation by academics, claiming her most popular stories, such as Peter Rabbit, were more than inspired by folktales told by African slaves, says a right-wing newspaper in Britain. A paper appeared coming out of the University of Cambridge called Bunnies in Children's Books, From Alice in Wonderland to Peter Rabbit. And in the article, it says, are rabbits universally popular in children's literature? And then on the last 3 lines, we read, but they also have a broader heritage. One might argue that the Peter Rabbit stories owe a great deal to Brer Rabbit, the African-American folktales adapted by Joel Chandler Harris in the late 19th century. Beatrix Potter even illustrated 8 scenes from the Brer Rabbit Uncle Remus stories in the same years as she began her first sketches of Peter. We have it. There is the proof. So, Brer Rabbit, Peter Rabbit, Bugs Bunny, all of them coming from African folktales told by African Americans, told by people in the Bahamas, told by people in the Turks and Caicos Islands. Now, this is what Wikipedia says. As of 2008, the Peter Rabbit series of 6 books has sold more than 150 million copies in 35 languages. Let that sink in. Now, you should be asking yourselves 2 key questions here. Question number 1. Would the world see enslaved Africans differently if they knew about the African prototypes of Bugs Bunny and Peter Rabbit? And 2, should Africans have financially benefited from Bugs Bunny and Peter Rabbit? 2 powerful questions. Now, here's the thing. As we progress through this class, there's a common theme, and the common theme looks like this. We get the African origin of a concept. We get the transfer of that concept to the Western world by enslaved people. We get its exploitation by non-Africans. We get silence on the African origin. And finally, we get the creation of transgenerational wealth gaps where the people who are able to exploit these African ideas are able to make millions and pass it on to their children, who inherit millions, who pass that on to their children. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans pass on nothing but poverty to their children, who inherit poverty, and that gets passed down to the next generation. And this is the reason why the world of today, 2023, looks the way it does in terms of wealth and poverty. Okay, let me take a couple questions. As usual, you're going to have to read those questions to me because I can't see anything but my screen.
Okay. So in terms of taking questions from the audience, that's what you're waiting for now?
Yeah, so if people want to write something in the chat, or if there's any comments that people have already put in that you think is useful, throw them my way.
Okay. So family, if you got any questions, ask Professor Walker right now. Be a good time. Just throw them in the chat and we will address those questions. Okay. While we're waiting for that, just want to say shout out to those people, Brother Joe and I believe Kwaku for their super chats and their Cash App donations. Please also take this opportunity and thank you very much for that. Please take this opportunity also to like and share and comment on the video and help get the word out of the discussion. So while we're waiting for some questions, I think we have one here. Let me see. Okay. So waiting for a few. So I'll be waiting for a few questions to come in. We'll just kind of ask some of our questions that we have going on. So in America, we have this conversation centered around reparations to close the wealth gap and address some of the issues that are coming up in regards to appropriation of culture or just kind of getting free labor for 300 years. In the UK, is there a similar charge towards Parliament to try to get the Africans in the UK or throughout the diaspora, maybe the places that Britain colonized, to get reparations for them?
We're working on it. And I'm going to present at the end of this session some of the research on our leading academic who's done work on it. His name is Professor Robert Beckford. And the reparations demand in Britain has a bearing on the reparations demand of African Americans, because some of what Britain owes us, Britain owes to you as well. And I'm going to explain how I came to that conclusion at the end of the session.
Okay. All right. We had a question up. Okay, here it goes right here. What in recent development or discovery in African history that we should know about?
We come into that. We come in.
Oh, we're coming to that. Okay. Let me see. We also have another one here. Are they still exploiting African stories and folklore?
The fact that Bugs Bunny is still being shown, the fact that Beatrix Potter's books have gone legend, they're still making money out of our stuff, And
Yes,
but those aren't the only examples. That's just to get us warmed up. Yeah, that's just to get us warmed up.
Yes. All right. So we're going to take this last one and we'll continue on with the presentation. We have this other question here from Jesse Johnson, 86 of the UK. Were there any other fictional characters that were turned into famous books from African American folk tales like the one you just explained? That's a really good question.
There have been others as well. We can trace things like Anansi and that kind of thing. But with Anansi, we can definitely trace that to Ghana in Africa. And for me, growing up as a Jamaican boy, I grew up on Anansi stories. And as we're finding out more and more about folklore, there is an English scholar called Gerald Massey who wrote a book of the beginnings. He also wrote a book called Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World. A lot of European folklore, you can trace it, certainly in terms of structure, back to ancient African stories. For example, if you take the Book of the Dead, the Book of the Coming Forth, whatever you want to call it, you can see where Jason and the Argonauts is coming out of that stuff. The idea of the hero making this journey. You can look at stories like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So you really can make these kinds of connections.
Thank you. Okay, you want to move forward with the presentation, or you want to try to take a couple more questions?
No, let's keep it moving. All right, so what are the contributions of enslaved Africans to history? Very simply, we are going to examine the legacy of enslaved Africans in science and technology. And the main finding that I'm going to show is we create value. Right, let's deal with that. Now, have you all seen this? Dear students, they didn't steal slaves. They stole scientists, doctors, architects, teachers, entrepreneurs, astronomers, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, etc., and made them slaves. Sincerely, your ancestors. No doubt you've seen that go across social media. But my question is this: prove it. And for me, if you can't prove it, then nothing happened. My thing is, it's about proving that. And that leads us on to the question, were there technological transfers from Africa to the West during slavery? There's an African-American professor called Vincent Taraku Farrar, and his book is called Pre-Colonial African Material Culture. It's a 3-year-old book. It came out in 2020, and he says, yes, enslaved Africans brought agricultural technologies, horsemanship, cattle rearing, cotton technologies, mining, metallurgy, carpentry, boat building, and navigational skills to the Western world and the Caribbean. Now, can we detail the technological transfers during slavery? According to Professor Farrar, enslaved Africans brought the cultivation of African crops and Asian crops to the Americas. Bananas, plantains, rice, sorghum, cocoa yam, African yams, ackee, okra, black-eyed peas, pigeon peas, watermelon, etc., etc. Moreover, African techniques were capable of what the scientists who deal with technology call intensification. And intensification is, how do you take a technological technique and scale it up so that it could feed millions and millions of people? That's what's meant by intensification. And these African techniques were capable of doing this without the petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. Moreover, African farmers better assimilated Native American crops and farming technologies than European American farmers did. And this was one of the reasons for capturing Africans and putting them into slavery, because they could better make use of Native American crops. For instance, the agricultural range, abundance, and surplus available in maroon communities trounced what European settlers could produce by themselves, causing some maroons to mockingly call Europeans scarecrows. Now, let me explain what's going on here. Plantations where enslaved people lived and worked were basically concentration camps, or to be exact, concentration camps come out of this situation. So the state of which an enslaved African farmer lived, it would have been not much better than living in a concentration camp. But for the Maroons, people that ran away, for those of you that don't know, African Americans had Maroon communities too. People that ran away and set up their own mini Africas, usually in the forests or the swamps and that kind of thing. Those that did that could profit in terms of they could eat, consume their own crops. And the result was, when Europeans came across Maroon communities, it was a common thing for Maroons to mock the Europeans and call them scarecrows because of their skinny, desiccated appearance compared to the well-fedness of those free Africans that were living in Maroon communities. Now, here's the bombshell, though, from Professor Farrar's book. There are more varied systems and practices of rice cultivation in West Africa than in all of Asia. Now, what's going on in this picture? What's going on in this picture? Someone's opening a door and there's a sink behind the door. Let that sink in. For those of you that didn't get it, let that sink in. There were more systems of rice cultivating in West Africa than in all of Asia. And what that means is the origin of rice cultivation is a West African thing. So consequently, when enslaved Africans were captured in West Africa, they were able to bring these rice cultivation techniques, which they had originated, the first people in the world to have originated it, to the Americas. And it wasn't just African rice they were able to cultivate, it was Asian rice as well. Now, can we detail the technological transfers during slavery? A Portuguese expedition to Gambia in the mid-15th century recorded. Gambia, mid-15th century. Gambia is West Africa. Mid-15th century is about 1450 odd. And we are told the articles they brought were cotton cloth and thread. Cotton cloths woven in their fashion, some white, others variegated, white and blue striped, or red, blue, and white. Excellently made, says this Portuguese expedition to Gambia in West Africa. A British official writing in the mid-18th century is kind of 1750-ish. The cotton that has been carried from Senegal to Europe has been repeatedly proven to be the finest in the world. So here we have, over a 300-year period, West African cotton from Senegal and Gambia was the finest that the world had to offer. And I'm raising the question, is this why West Africans were targeted for cotton-based slavery? What do you think? Moreover, enslaved African women created a quilting and textile tradition from 4 African textile traditions: the Mande tradition, of what is today kind of Mali, the Fon and Yoruba traditions from Dahomey and Nigeria, the Ekoi tradition known for Nsibidi, Eastern Nigeria, and the Congo traditions of Central Africa. Now, what do we know about enslaved African American women and their textiles?
Concerned about time because that was what tripped me up last week.
Annie.
Hello.
Have you done patchwork before?
Nope.
It feels like a really fun thing to know how to do for ready for when you're a granny.
Yeah.
Patchwork quilting may be a humble craft to some, but thanks to a small group of quilters in America, it's become an art form in its own right. In the southern US state of Alabama is the tiny hamlet of Gee's Bend. Back in the 19th century, it was the site of a cotton plantation worked by enslaved people, where quilting was born out of necessity.
They were doing it to survive. They were living in log cabins with hardly any installation except for mud in between the logs. So they had to make coverings to keep themselves warm.
The women used scraps of old fabric and clothing, creating a distinctive free-form style, partly determined by the equipment available to them.
Because of the lack of scissors, they had to tear. And so that's where a lot of the shapes came from.
Thanks to the civil rights movement in the 60s, a new cooperative enabled the women to sell their work through department stores like Bloomingdale's and Saks.
With the department store, it wasn't a whole lot of creativity in the quilts because it was a pattern. So that was stressful for them because it had to be perfect. And if not, then they didn't get paid for it.
Quilts grew in popularity and critical acclaim. And in 2018, when Michelle Obama's official portrait as the First Lady was unveiled, the artist Amy Sherald cited the quilts of Gee's Bend as her inspiration.
Patchwork quilts invented by enslaved African American women. Did we know this? Right, here is a masterpiece of early African American textiles. It's in a museum and it's called Bethlehem. And you can see you've got the stars and so on. But if you look at the detail, the quality of the stitching, it was made by 2 enslaved women. All we know is one of them was called Auntie Ellen and the other one was called Auntie Mary. And their work is in a museum in the United States. And there's more. I came across this etching, and what's going on in the etching, let me show you what the caption says. Indigo processing in South Carolina, the United States in the 18th century. The work was done entirely by enslaved people of African descent and Native American descent. And you can see two Europeans in the bottom right-hand corner. Everybody else is African or Native American. And for those of you wanting to look at the origin of indigo processing, in West Africa, there was a civilization called Hausaland. Hausaland is northern Nigeria, and that is the place in Africa where these indigo processing techniques in South Carolina originated from. Now, can we get more detail on technological transfers during slavery? Well, Africans from the Senegambian region were noted for their skills in horsemanship and cattle rearing in the early history of South Carolina. African livestock production was important, especially in the areas of the United States nicknamed Indian country, but also Haiti, Brazil, and elsewhere in South America. At one time, all the cowboys in mid-16th century Hispaniola were Africans. Hispaniola is the island that we would today call Haiti and Dominica. Some scholars further claim that it was Africans who introduced the rearing of African stock into the Americas, including cattle, sheep, and goats. Now, scholars aren't sure about that one, but all the other facts stack up. And in the US territories, it is thought that 1/3 of all the cowboys were Africans. So what furniture did enslaved Africans make? Well, some of those furniture pieces have ended up in museums, and these are pieces that we know for a fact were made by enslaved Africans who were forced into making these pieces. Now, aren't they exquisite? Do you think that they deserve the kind of thing that should be in museums? These are pieces definitely known to have been made by enslaved carpenters. Now, Africans were in demand as carpenters, and African architectural sensibilities influenced New World architecture from New England to the Caribbean to Brazil. Professor Vincent Taraku Farrar says, most of us here in the United States, for example, would not imagine that the cellar and the porch, both common enough architectural features, are in the evolution of American domestic architecture of African inspiration. Wow. Now, scholars have detected African ideas and technologies in the construction of the grand houses as well. The most recent one, of course, is we now know that the White House huge numbers of enslaved Africans helped to build that. Now, Professor Farrar gave the example of the shotgun house. And Wikipedia says folklorist and professor John Michael Vlach has suggested that the origin of the building style and the name itself may trace back to Haiti and Africa during the 18th century and earlier. Okay, so what's a shotgun house? It's a very narrow form of house where all the rooms are lined up. And can you see that we've got the architectural feature, the porch? And this is the typical type of house that you see in places like New Orleans and that kind of thing. And this is what Professor James Dietz, he did an excavation of a house in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And this is what he wrote. It was while this cellar was being excavated. So in other words, they're excavating a cellar of a house. Let's read what it says. That a discovery was made that raised a number of important questions about the site and its inhabitants. Broken on the cellar floor were two large earthenware jars, unlike any before encountered on a New England historical site. These jars were made in the West Indies and served as sugar containers for shipment to various colonial ports. They are also said to have been used at times for storing and shipping tamarind, a West African cultivated fruit that was grown in the West Indies. Okay, so what's important about this house that with a cellar? Well, the owner of that house was connected to the West Indies. and was storing and shipping tamarind, or West African cultivated fruit. In other words, James Dietz came to the conclusion that the owner of this house that he was excavating was an African, and therefore the idea then of a porch and a cellar and this house called the Shotgun House being African in origin, all the evidence is lining up. Now, this is what Britannica says. Shotgun house, narrow house prevalent in African American communities in New Orleans and other areas of southern United States. It then goes on to say, however, the term may also be derived from togun, the Yoruba word meaning house or gathering place. So shotgun in English is thought to be togun in Yoruba. So Yoruba type of dwelling brought to the Americas by enslaved Africans, who then used that building technique and technology in New Orleans with porches and cellars. Did we know this? And moreover, Britannica says the ingenious use of limited space. That's very, very important, because one of the issues when it comes to African technologies in the Americas is the rational use of the technology, getting the best use out of the available materials. Now, what else? Africans were widely employed as boat builders who created large ocean-worthy canoes, watercraft for the coast, rivers, and for fishing. And they proved more adaptive to their environments than European crafts. One source said, since there were very few roads in the South connecting tidewater settlements, most of the travel was done by small boats. Slaves who rowed the canoes often had to serve as guides as well as boatmen. There are ample statistics from 18th century Virginia to show that blacks had a strong control over the waterways. We find that use of West Indian type of craft had by the last quarter of the 18th century spread across most of the eastern seaboard. Africans were way disproportionately involved in the shipping industry, even as pilots. And in the Caribbean, it was a common sight to see ships with white captains and an almost entirely black crews from the late 17th through the mid-19th centuries. And the fact that black people were involved in shipping, a lot of folk music that we think of as, for example, Scottish and Irish folk songs, they call them sea shanties, were actually produced by enslaved Africans. And so we can trace a lot of sea shanties that ended up as Irish and Scottish folk music. We can trace that back to enslaved Africans working on the ships from this time period. Now, have we heard of Oluda Equiano? And if we have heard of Oluda Equiano, what did he do for a living? If you know the answer, put it in the chat. As I said, I can't see the chat, so perhaps Taki could read to me if someone has an answer to what did Oluda Equiano do for a living?
All right. You know what, Professor Walker, there's a delay with the chat, so when people answer the question, I'll put it up, and I'll let you know if you want to just keep going. As soon as I see the answer out.
All right, now, can we detail more technological transfers? The first metallurgists to enter the Americas in the wake of 1492 were Africans who accompanied the Spanish. Europeans in the Americas were dependent on African iron workers and coppersmiths. They also depended on African miners who mined gold and copper in Hispaniola, Cuba, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. Africans originally from West Africa were skilled in gold mining. Africans originally from West Central and South Central Africa were skilled in copper mining. And you can now see who's going to get targeted for slavery because they've got these techniques of gold mining, copper mining, and metallurgy. Now, Africans as metallurgists, really? Now, you all know that this monument is the Museum of African American Art in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, was partly built by a Black British architect, Sir David Ajayi. But this is what their website says about this monument. By wrapping
I'm sorry, Professor Walker. I just wanted to give you the answer. We had I hope I'm saying the name right, Quadwo. a writer and evolutionist. A couple other people said writer, some other people said evolutionist.
He was actually, Oluda Equiano was actually a sailor. And the reason I say that is in Black British history, Oluda Equiano is the most famous Black Briton of the 18th century. He was enslaved in Barbados, he was enslaved in Virginia, and he became a sailor. And on a voyage to the North Pole, he took part in that voyage and, sort of documented. And the reason I'm pointing that out is he's an example of the enslaved Africans being disproportionately involved in the shipping industry. All right, now this monument, the museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, this is what we read on their website. By wrapping the entire building in an ornamental bronze-colored metal lattice, Ajayi pays homage to the intricate iron work created by enslaved African Americans in Louisiana, South Carolina, and elsewhere. And so the design of this museum with this metal cage around it is to represent the skilled ironwork brought to the Americas by enslaved Africans in Louisiana, South Carolina, and elsewhere. All right, let me take a couple questions.
Okay, so family, anyone who has questions for Professor Walker, this is a good time to put them in the chat. Okay, we have a great question from Kurt Thomas. Could a number of enslaved people have actually been the blacks expelled from Spain in 1492? Those skilled people?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that, Kurt Thomas. I actually had a question as you were talking about the Scottish and Irish shanty, I believe. Right. Okay. The jig, the Irish jig, the dance, is that something that they adopted from Africans as well?
No, that's their thing. But in the evolution of what's called Irish step dance, some of you may have seen the show Riverdance, which is based on Irish step dance. So there's another show called Lord of the Dance, where there's what appears to be tap dancing moves. What happened was crossover between Irish culture and African American culture. And that meant that some Irish step dance moves ended up in tap dancing, and some of our thing ended up in their dance. So there's a crossover, but the crossover didn't happen with the jig. It happened with what they call step dance, or what African Americans call tap dancing.
Okay. We have a question here from Kofi Campbell. Did the Florida curriculum deny blacks what skills over? Essentially, he's asking the curriculum.
Yeah, and this is the reason why I'm doing this session, to show you what technological skills Africans actually brought to the Americas. And these technological skills no one is talking about, with the exception of Professor Vincent Taraku Farrar.
Okay. All right. We're going to take this last one, then we'll move forward. Black African has a great question here. What's your position on the European museums being sued to return our stolen artifacts?
I think it needs to happen. Yeah, I think it needs to happen. They're sitting on millions and millions of pounds worth of assets that do not belong to them, and they can use those assets to enrich themselves, and they need to go back to their owners.
Facts. Okay, Professor Walker, you want to continue?
Okay, let's do it. Okay, what else did enslaved people do? And by the way, that's Oluda Equiano. Never seen the face, here he is. And this is what Oluda Equiano says in his book. I have sometimes heard it asserted that a Negro cannot earn his master the original price, but nothing can be further from the truth. I suppose 9/10 of the mechanics throughout the West Indies are Negro slaves. And I well know the coopers, makers of barrels, among them earn $2 a day. The carpenters the same, and oftentimes more, as also the masons, smiths, and fishermen, etc. So, enslaved Africans in the West Indies were mechanics, that means skilled laborer, as well as what we understand as mechanics today, carpenters, masons, smiths, and fishermen. Now, that's taken from the interesting narrative of the life of Oluda Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vassa, the African. Now, many of you will be thinking, mechanics? You know, that kind of skeptical look. Okay, so what's the evidence? Where is the evidence? Where is it? Joe Anderson, enslaved mechanic. Joe Anderson was either 50 or 100% responsible for an 1834 patent. The American Bar Association website had an article by Professor Shontavia Johnson, an intellectual property lawyer, and this is what this intellectual property lawyer says about this 1834 patent. Plantation owner Cyrus McCormick received a patent for an invention that transformed farming and made him a multi-millionaire, the mechanical reaper. Some people call it the combined harvester. Today, most people also attribute the reaper's invention to Joe Anderson, an enslaved man owned by the McCormick family. Another source says, in July 1831, the reaper was first tested before an audience of friends, neighbors, and skeptics in the Shenandoah Valley. McCormick's grandson wrote, Joe Anderson was there, the Negro slave who through the crowded hours of recent weeks had helped build the reaper. Joe Anderson deserves honor as the man who worked beside him in the building of the reaper. Joe Anderson was a slave, a general farm laborer, and a friend, and the Negro toiled with him up to the hour of the test and after. So this is the harvester, and the patent says C.H. McCormick, patented June 21st, 1834. And according to Professor Shontavia Jackson Johnson, that patent either 100% belongs to Joe Anderson, or it should have done, or 50% belongs to Joe Anderson. Is he the only example? Benjamin Montgomery was another enslaved mechanic. He was enslaved in Virginia in 1819, and he was owned by the brother of Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. In 1858, Benjamin Montgomery invented a propeller for ocean vessels. With a model of his invention, he showed remarkable skills in wood and metalworking. Moreover, the merits of his invention were reported in many Southern newspapers and were finally used in ships of the Confederate Navy. Now, Equiano said, I have known many slaves whose masters would not accept an offer of 1,017.89 pounds for them. That is how much value enslaved Africans are contributing. As we've seen, enslaver Cyrus McCormick made a fortune from his slaves' inventions. And the key question, can we begin to put a figure on how much value enslaved Africans created? Do you think we can do this? And Black scholar in Britain, Professor Robert Beckford, commissioned some powerful research in 2005. And this is what he found.
So my next question is the big one. How much are we in Britain owed? No one has ever dared to calculate Britain's debt to its former slaves. I'm no expert in these matters, so I tracked down the country's top specialists and asked them if, for the first time ever, they could come up with a figure for reparations. 3 men rise to the challenge.
In agriculture.
David Richardson is an economic historian and authority on the slave trade in Britain.
We might talk perhaps about 20 years of employment at £10 a year.
Peter Tompkins is an actuary, an expert witness in loss of earnings cases.
You deduct from that the value.
And Mick Antonin is one of the leading lawyers in the field of workers' compensation. The team decide that the first figure they should look at is compensation for unpaid labour.
I want to know
How do we calculate the cost of unpaid labour?
The agricultural wage rate in England was about £1 a day.
If I were a slave, I would be being fed and housed, obviously, to keep me able to work. But if I'd been paid, I'd have had to pay for my board and lodging in order to keep myself satisfied.
The team decide that if a slave was paid the going rate of £10 a year, after deducting cost of living expenses, this comes to £200 in earnings for a lifetime of slavery.
And don't forget, in the 18th century, agricultural...
But Peter explains that with compensation, compound interest applies to make up for what you would have earned on the money.
You're probably looking at £200 then, growing to about £1 million today.
So that £200 that each slave wasn't paid is subject to compound interest, and that gives us a figure of £1 million in lost wages for every slave. But that's just for one person.
Yes.
So how many people are we talking about?
What we do know are, first of all, the numbers of enslaved Africans who were transported to the Americas on British ships. Perhaps 500,000 of those died before they reached America. Are we including those?
I think what you're talking about, those that survived.
Those that survived, fine. So we're talking about then...
About 3 million.
We're talking around 2.9 million, 3 million people.
So that's 3 million Africans taken to work as slaves for the British Empire. Another million were born into slavery, which gives us 4 million slaves from the late 1600s to the end of the slave trade in 1807. So to calculate the unpaid wages, we take 4 million slaves times £1 million each in lost earnings, and this comes out to a tidy £4 trillion. The unpaid wages alone of £4 trillion is mind-boggling, and the team say that's just the beginning.
So we've got £4 trillion then in 2005 money. That's not 4 trillion today. That was 4 trillion in 2005. And that is just unpaid wages. We're not talking about your Cyrus McCormick's making millions. We're not talking about the loss to people like Benjamin Montgomery. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about your regular workaday enslaved people. But it doesn't just stop there.
Britain got filthy rich from sugar during slavery days. So what was the genocide of millions of Africans worth to the British economy? The team are now coming up with a figure for what the lawyers call unjust enrichment.
We're talking about an industry which was adding something like £5 million a year to the British economy.
The sugar industry was worth £5 million annually at its height from the 17th century to the middle of the 18th century. So taking 100 years at 5 million, that comes to £500 million.
Grossing it for investment since then, and putting it in today's terms, you're talking about 2.5 trillion.
So with compound interest, that 500 million comes to a total of £2.5 trillion for the unjust enrichment from the sugar trade.
The UK economy today has a GDP of about £1.2 trillion, I think. And I think it would be unreasonable for me to suggest that the enrichment was twice the value of the economy today. I think that's not really realistic.
Yeah. Except you're talking over a 100-year period, isn't it? So I mean, you're global. You're putting a global figure rather than taking 1 year now compared with 100 years of profit. So the figure isn't really that unrealistic when you put it in those terms.
But I want to raise a contentious point to put it into context. Now, my family are from Jamaica. One of the questions that arises out of slavery in the Caribbean isn't just that the British brought us there, but also that the Africans sold us. Should we therefore be making a claim against Africans for unjust enrichment?
But most estimates that I've seen suggest that, on balance, Africa was a loser by the slave trade.
Well, that settles it for me. Africa's net gain from the slave trade equals 0. But it's the human cost that stays with me. How can you put a price on that?
If you listen to the biographies of the enslaved themselves, they talk about the pain and suffering they experienced in being detached from their own family.
I asked the team how we could arrive at a figure to compensate the slaves for pain and suffering.
Perhaps looking at cases where there are miscarriages of justice, people who've been put into bondage in UK jails. And again, it's quite difficult to assess, but some cases have put around about £14,000 a year. So someone who's in slavery for 20 years, that would work out at a figure of around about £250,000 or so.
So being enslaved for 20 years at £12,500 a year compensation for wrongful imprisonment works out to £250,000 for each slave suffering. If you multiply that by 4 million slaves, that works out to £1 trillion. So the team have come up with this: £4 trillion in unpaid wages, £2.5 trillion for the unjust enrichment of the British economy through the profits of the sugar industry, and another £1 trillion for pain and suffering. The grand total of Britain's debt to its slaves comes to a massive £7.5 trillion. How do you respond to that?
The figure is very reasonable and realistic.
I think your most sensible hope is that it brings home the message that actually there is an economic legacy, and you address an economic legacy by trying to rectify things for future generations.
Thank you for your work on this. It's been very important and also momentous, because this is the first time that anyone in the UK has come up with a figure.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, Africans created enormous monetary value for our enslavers. And in the case of the British Empire, how much it created for the enslaved people was $7.5 trillion, measured in 2005 prices. So consequently, we can now estimate how much poorer we are than we should have been. We should either have been £7.5 trillion richer than we are, or Europeans as a whole that benefited, the side that benefited, they're £7.5 trillion richer than they should have been. Now, at 2005 prices, this created a £7.5 trillion wealth gap between Britain and its former slaves. So who are the former slaves? It would be people from the Caribbean, such as my family. It will be African Americans in in Virginia. Those will be a part of the people too. So in other words, it's a lot of money. Similar calculations can be done for Spain, because Spain enslaved people all over South America and Central America. Portugal, massive slave trading power. Holland, enslaved people in Southern Africa, enslaved people in Brazil, enslaved people in New York. New York used to be called New Amsterdam. Denmark, the Danish Virgin Islands, Sweden, same thing. And that's just what those countries owed their former slaves. Then you've got every white-dominated country in the Americas that had a black population: Brazil, the United States, Colombia. And that's a separate payment, because you then have a separate payment that America owes its former enslaved people, what Brazil owes its former enslaved people. And you're just going to end up with some very, very ridiculous figures of lots and lots and lots of trillions. Now, what about the scientific transfers? What do you mean scientific transfers? Yes, folks, enslaved Africans were responsible for bringing certain scientific transfers from Africa to the Americas.
Consider the fortune of the person who, in effect, invented vaccination, introduced vaccination to America in 1721. That has to be the biggest fortune in the history of medicine, right? The pharmaceutical industry has produced many gigantic fortunes in this country, notably the fortune created by Robert Wood Johnson and his brothers in 1885, when they started the Johnson & Johnson Company, which has produced many products that have saved lives and led to the creation of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which has done many good deeds. And that fortune has provided for generation upon generation of some members of the class that used to be known as the idle rich. The person who introduced immunizations in America was born into a caste that was not allowed to profit from his wisdom, from his genius, or even from his labor. He was a slave owned by a minister in Boston, a slave who saved lives in Boston during the smallpox epidemic of 1721, when he described a procedure that he had undergone in Africa before his life was stolen from him on a slave ship. Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson tells this story in her new book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. Quote, people in West Africa had discovered that they could fend off contagions by inoculating themselves with a specimen of fluid from an infected person. That is the knowledge that slave brought to Boston in 1721, where he saved dozens of lives because of one doctor who decided to try that method that the slave described. 30 years later, vaccinations based on that method, introduced by a slave, became the standard practice in Massachusetts and eventually the rest of the country. There is no charitable foundation named for that slave. His descendants were not born into lives where work was optional. The life-saving gift he gave us did not even earn him his freedom.
And the enslaved African that is being described here, his name is Onesimus, and Onesimus is the person responsible for bringing the smallpox vaccine from Africa to the Americas 1721. Now, what's going on here? Again, you've got a doorway. You look behind the doorway, there's a sink. Or as I like to say, let that sink in. Are we getting this? The jokes don't get any better, trust me. Right, so here it is, the historical account of the smallpox inoculated in New England. Now, in this account, they don't mention the enslaved African, but they mention his enslaver. And it's the same story. They just missed out. They didn't say that it came from his slave, but there it is. Now, how effective were West African medical practices in the West? Now, in Jamaica, there's a very famous nurse called Mary Seacole. And this is what Wikipedia says. In Jamaica, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, neonatal deaths were more than a quarter of total births. However, Seacole, using, and I've underlined this, traditional West African herbal remedies and hygienic practices, boasted that she never lost a mother or her child. So that shows the high quality of West African herbal treatment and hygienic practices. The same Wikipedia page says, in Cuba, Seacole is remembered with great fondness by those she nursed back to health, where she became known as the yellow woman from Jamaica with the cholera medicine. So here we're seeing West African herbal remedies, hygienic practices being effective in cutting neonatal deaths and cholera suppressant treatments as well. Now, did we know this? Right-wing British newspaper published in London, the Mail, it says, the slave who taught Jack Daniels how to make whiskey. Bourbon giant finally acknowledges the truth after 150 years. Did we know this? So how did the story get out? Well, this is what happened.
The makers of Jack Daniels, America's favorite whiskey, have admitted for the first time that the person responsible for creating the recipe behind the brand was in fact a Tennessee slave. For 150 years, the legend has it that Dan Call, a reverend bootlegger, passed on the secrets of his recipe to Jasper Newton, Jack Daniel, but is now finally admitted that in fact it wasn't Dan Call, but Dan Call's slave, Nearest Green, who was responsible for creating the secrets behind the recipe, and that it was Nearest Green who passed on the recipe to Jasper Daniel, and then from that created the iconic brand.
Did we know this? So what happened next? Well, because African American historians have got on the case, they've now come up with a new whiskey called Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey, trying to do a little bit of righting a wrong, only a little bit. So they've come up with this whiskey called Uncle Nearest 1856 to give Nearest Nathan Green a little bit of shine, when in reality, all the profits of Jack Daniel's whiskey should actually have gone to him and his descendants. So who were the other enslaved STEM pioneers? Professor Shantavia Jackson Johnson, the intellectual property lawyer on the American Bar Association website, says, at the turn of the 19th century, a Kentucky slave invented the hemp brake. In about 1800, a Massachusetts slave named Ebar invented a method of making brooms out of corn stalks. In about 1825, an Alabama slave named Hezekiah invented a machine for cleaning cotton. In 1831, a Charleston, South Carolina slave named Anthony Weston invented an improvement on a threshing machine invented by W.T. Cato. And in 1839, a North Carolina slave named Stephen Slade invented a method of curing tobacco that enabled the creation of the modern cigarette. So, what was the legacy of enslaved Africans to history? The legacy is this: we create value. That's the legacy. All right, let me take a couple questions.
All right, wow, family, just definitely want to give this is a phenomenal, give Professor Walker his due on this one. It's a phenomenal presentation, far exceeded any expectation that I had. It's great. I have some questions here, but family, if you also have some questions, make sure you put them in the chat. I was trying to keep notes as you were talking, and we create value. I love that, and we have the value of goods. And one of those goods that we spoke of, I'm just curious to know more about, is why was the indigo production so profitable to Europeans?
It's a very rare color. Indigo is associated with royalty, and it goes back a long way. According to Professor Ivan van Sertima, it was considered a royal color even in ancient Egyptian times. And so this association with the color purple, which is a derivative of indigo, with royalty. For example, in Britain, we have a type of chocolate called dairy milk chocolate, and the wrapping is put in a kind of purple indigo kind of, to give it that luxurious thing. So the color purple is associated with luxury, is associated with wealth.
So the indigo production was primarily used for like just their clothes in Europe, indeed, things of that nature. Okay. Yeah. All right. So we speak a lot about reparations of enslaved people. What about reparations for like the Berlin Conference? What happened in the late 19th century, late 19th century, with Europeans dividing Africa in that way to steal the riches? What about conversations regarding that?
That's a separate conversation. It needs to happen, but the reason why I want to keep them as separate conversations is so that we don't lose sight on how much enslaved people are owed for slavery, how much people are owed for colonization, and then for the destruction and looting that happened through colonization, whole cities being burned out. So we keep each tally on what we're owed separate. Do you see? But that conversation definitely needs to happen.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, absolutely, definitely needs to happen. I have one more last question. Then we're going to take a question here from Kofi Campbell. Sequel. Is there any direct link tracing her, what she did medically, to the common medical practices of gynecologists and so forth?
That's controversial. Let me tell you what the controversy is. In England, there is an attempt to elevate a nurse called Florence Nightingale. And Florence Nightingale being white, they want to elevate her. And the way they elevate Florence Nightingale is they classify what Florence Nightingale did as to create the first modern British hospitals. Now, Mary Seacole is known to have set up a building with bedrooms, with beds for our wounded soldiers. But because they want to give the credit to Florence Nightingale, they call what Mary Seacole had a hotel rather than a hospital. Do you see?
Mm.
And that's the way the historians try to play it, to undervalue what Mary Seacole did and overvalue what Florence Nightingale did. Because here's the thing. If you call what Mary Seacole did a hospital, then it cancels out the contributions of Florence Nightingale. Do you see? Now, is there a direct link between modern gynecology and obstetrics and Mary Seacole? I don't know if there's a direct link. But I do know that certainly the role of Black women, certainly in Britain, that's our game. We had that game. Do you see? Even things like the delivery of some of the royal babies was done by Black British women. So we had that game. Yeah. You can look her up. There's a professor called Jacqueline Dunkley Bent, and she's quite possibly the highest position midwife in Europe. And, she's one of us.
Okay. All right. And last question is from Kofi Campbell. What were the African contributions to the Industrial Revolution? I love this question.
The mechanizations of for example, did I say that 9/10 of all the mechanics in the West Indies was at one time African slaves? And what's then happened is the metallurgical techniques developed by enslaved people in Jamaica is the same metallurgical techniques that were then brought to Britain during the Industrial Revolution. And that's a recent discovery, and you can Google this yourself. There's a British newspaper called The Guardian, and if you type in Jamaican slaves and the Industrial Revolution, the metallurgical techniques, and they name something like, they don't name them, but they cite something like 69 enslaved Black metal workers were responsible for certain technologies that ended up being brought to Britain for the Industrial Revolution.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Do you want to continue on?
Yeah. Okay, so remember this. The Black Secret Education Project, quietly empowering the people. Would you like to learn more Black history and African heritage? You see, this lecture that you're seeing here is the kind of thing that I teach in general. Go to our site, www.theblacksecret.co.uk, and subscribe. No, we're not charging you £4,000 to subscribe, nor is it £400. It is just £35 per calendar month, or $46 per calendar month. But we do have a special offer. We are offering a 48% discount because we like that. And so for a limited time period, so you need to jump on this quickly, it is £18 or $23 per calendar month. The classes are filmed in a London classroom. They're all filmed, they're all online, 55 hours worth of history content. And you can watch the content at your own convenience. You can download the lecture notes. So you've got the lecture notes you can follow. You can watch the classes 10:30 in the morning, 6 p.m. at night, midnight, 3 o'clock in the morning. You can watch 10 minutes here, freeze, and then come back to it the following day and carry on from where you left off. Totally at your convenience. You can start and stop each class. And you've got full access to the lecture notes. There's also quizzes where you can test yourself. So to make sure you're really learning the information, $23 per calendar month. You need to jump in because this is the discounted price. And that is us addressing Ron DeSantis on the technological contributions of enslaved Africans to civilization. This concludes the presentation. And the website, if you want more information, is www.theblacksecret.co.uk. And subscribe today before we put the price up. And that is it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So the website that you had, that's like we had up a second ago, is that where they also get some of your books?
No. If you want to get hold of the books, if you're in America, for When We Ruled, get it from Black Classic Press. And then my other books, you can find them at Amazon.
Okay. Definitely want to make sure you get some of your great work. Before we move on, I just want to give a special happy love shout out to Gene Smith. Every time we have a show and others publications or features, we get love, and definitely want to give a special shout out to Gene Smith for that. Thank you so much for your love and contribution, and everyone else. See Wendy and a few others also had the super chats. Thank you so much. Yes, Doriel Laria said this was amazing. It was so amazing. Thank you so much. It definitely gave me a lot of context and things to think about in terms of what we're owed and how we create value. It was an amazing presentation. We also want to give a special shout out to all the UK watchers. I know there were several people in there from the UK, and it's kind of, it's kind of late now. What is it, like almost 1 o'clock in the morning there now?
12 o'clock midnight.
12 midnight. Okay. All right. So definitely want to give a special shout out for the people in the UK hanging out with us in this kind of late hour. Professor Walker, do you have any other final words, anything you would like to kind of add to the presentation or before you go?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's been a delight to do this. And we want people to join our course and learn the systematic content. And join the course, www.theblacksecret.co.uk. Jump in before we put the price up. And whatever price you jump in at, it will be frozen at that price as we add more and more and more content. Nice. So hope people enjoy this. Yes, sir.
I have one last question for you. And this is a question people, I won't say controversial, but this is something there's a lot of speculation around this object or this monument there in the UK, and that is Stonehenge. Can we say definitively that it was an African contribution or African civilization helped develop it?
I don't know yet.
Fair enough.
Yeah, my position is very, very much, I like to stick to what I know would stand up in court. And we're not in a position to say so yet. This is what there is. Have you heard of Cheddar Man? I don't know if you've heard of Cheddar Man.
No, I have not.
Okay, there is a skeleton that was discovered in Britain, and it's about 10,000 years old. And it's been recently reconstructed, the face, the hair, and so on. And it looks like an Australian Aborigine. And that is now shocking the far right into recognizing that's the first Briton. Now, what we can't prove yet is that the population of Britain stayed the same from Cheddar Man all the way down to Stonehenge. We can't say that yet. And until we can say that, I can't really speak on Stonehenge. Notice what I'm saying. Yet. When we can prove that, then we're going to go there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So if you could just give me a brief moment while I close out the show, I'd love to talk to you backstage. Please hang out just for a moment. We'll be quick. And we're going to take kind of some closing words for the audience. Thank you. Again, thank you so much for being here. I enjoyed this immensely. I know the audience did. And we look forward to having you again in the future. Thank you so much. So happy family. Again, shout out to everyone that showed the what we call the happy love, Cash App love. The super chats, cash apps, your donations go a long way. We also have one more coming in. When we do our our printing and so forth, and our just publications in terms of getting the word out to you all, it comes by way of Black businesses, and the love that you guys show help us support those businesses and help kind of show our people that they have value, and they create value, kind of what Professor Walker was talking about in the presentation there. So everything that you guys do is greatly appreciated with respect to just keeping these things flowing. One couple other things. If you're not done so already, please follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. Everything at Happy Film. Happy Film, HAPI FILM. For those people who are not already signed up or just following us on those platforms, we're also on the 40,000K push on YouTube. So please definitely like, follow, share. We all spoke earlier about the newsletter. For those people who are not signed up for the newsletter, please make sure you take this opportunity to do so. The big thing is the trip, all right? Or gotta get that up my mind. The journey, the pilgrimage to the Nile, to the Hoppy Valley, that we'll be doing in February 16th to the 25th. Discover the origins of economics in Egypt with Hoppy. Such an essential conversation, such an essential factor, because economics, we know, is the foundation of civilization. Everything we've done or we do must have an economic foundation to it. We call it the plan before the plan. We look at the pyramids as these great monuments, but do understand, before the plan to develop pyramids was derived, they had to have an economic plan that was its foundation. And we understand that economic plan is the foundation for civilization. We must understand what economics is. The conversations that will be taking place in Egypt will be marrying the two together, the two being who we are culturally with our economics, thus helping us develop ourselves or help us obtain economic empowerment. This is so fundamentally important for us now, then, as well as now, and also for us in the future. This is not to be taken as any just going to Egypt. This is not what this is. We also have to see this as the understanding or the notion of, we know who we are, but the question is, what do we do with it? And that's what we're doing here. Is we got the information, we know we were great, we know this, we know that, but what is the next steps forward? How do we get to that next step? And this is why this is so important. And we don't look at this as just another tour, but understanding that is going to take us to that next level. The information that's going to be received there is going to help us get there. So that's very critically important. Those who are not aware, we have a clearance sale for Happy merchandise at hapifilm.com. Please go check that out and make sure that you support in that way. Everything has been kind of marked down so we can make way for new merchandise. So definitely please take that opportunity to do that. Shout out to Ellen Morris, the super chat. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. We also want to definitely give a shout out to everyone who was present today, who's been a part of the program. And we look forward to seeing you guys again in the future. Also, my brother Lorenzo Small, definitely his love and support for everything that we're doing. So with that said, we're going to close out the show. Just thank you for being here this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Peace.
know what we can talk about in this nation without talking about white superiority, honestly.
Who defines the meaning of God also defines the relationship between economy and God.
African Americans spent $1.3 trillion last year, making us the 16th wealthiest nation in the world. Why have we not turned those riches into wealth to develop our community?